Okay, so now that our arm, in terms of controls and in terms of functionality at least, is complete, we need to turn our attention to the wrist. Now we will be coming back to the arm later on and doing something interesting with the lower arm in terms of the lower arm and twisting based on the wrist control. But right now I want to turn our attention to designing a wrist control because we're going to do something a little bit interesting with our wrist control. So let's jump over to the whiteboard. And we know that our wrist position is controlled by the end of the arm. We cannot change the position of our wrist because that's already being defined by where the end of our arm is. So we know that our wrist is always going to be positioned at the end of the arm. However, we don't at the moment have any way of controlling the orientation of a wrist. So we need to devise some way of controlling our wrist's orientation. Now, sometimes it could be very useful to work in an FK-like manner, where if our arm was to rotate at the shoulder, that would bring the lower arm up. If the lower arm was to rotate at the elbow, that would bring our wrist up, and the wrist would inherit the orientation from the lower arm and then rotate from there. So we'd have something that worked a little bit like this. So this could be our upper arm and our lower arm. Then if we had our wrist like so, pointing up, if we rotated our shoulder down like so, and then our lower arm would look like that, our wrist would probably come down like this. So you can see that everything has rotated in the same way. So we're getting FK style control. So sometimes that could be really useful. Sometimes to get nice arcs of motion, to get nice overlapping motion, it could be very useful to have the wrist behave in an FK-like manner. However, there could be other times where it could be very useful to specify a specific orientation for our wrist and not have it change when the lower arm changes its orientation. For example, let's say that our arm had its upper arm, there's the lower arm, and we had our wrist, for whatever reason, horizontal, and we rotated our lower arm down, like so. Sometimes it could be very useful, instead of having our wrist face down like that, which would be the FK style of things, to keep its orientation, to stay oriented like that. Or even if our upper arm was to rotate down, and then our lower arm, of course, would all rotate down with it. Instead of having our wrist looking again something like this, we'd want to have our wrist maintain its orientation. So sometimes it could be useful for our wrist to always maintain its orientation. That means we're going to need two rotational controls existing in two spaces. For the FK style space, we need that rotational control to exist in the space of the lower arm. We need the rotational control to inherit any of the orientations of the lower arm. However, for our more IK style wrist control, we want that to really exist in world space. Well, it's going to currently be world space. It will eventually become master control space when we create our master control in character rigging 2. Right now we don't have a master control, so we're actually going to set this up to be world space. So as with our FK to IK in the arm, if we're going to have two sets of controls here, we really need a way to blend between them. Furthermore, it's essential that we provide an animator with an easy way to match one control to another. It's really no good for an animator to come in, work with our FK style control, have a wrist oriented like this. They go to blend over because the next piece of animation requires IK style control, and that IK style control is in a completely different orientation. It would take them a long time to try and match those. We can automate the process for them, so it's essential that we provide them with an easy way to do that. What we'll use are buttons like with our arm, where we can match IK to FK and FK to IK, only in this case we'll be matching what I'm going to refer to, and I'm going to be referring to this quite a bit throughout this DVD and also in the next DVD, referring to these as attached controls. This is an attached control because it inherits the orientations from the body part that actual control really is attached to. And detached controls. This is a detached control because it inherits its orientations from the world or from the master controller, not from the other body parts that it's attached to. So we're going to have a match attached to detach button and a match detached to attach button. Now that's all very well in terms of the wrist orientation, but there's actually one last feature I'd like to add to this wrist control, which makes it a little more interesting than simply having two rotational controls. You see, rotational controls work fine when you're dealing with the arm being controlled by FK, because we position the shoulder and then we position the elbow and then we'd position the wrist and we'd be switching back and forth, and that would be fine. We'd be doing that by rotating the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and that would work fine. However, when we're dealing with IK, we use an IK handle to specify the wrist position. And now we have a separate control that's specifying wrist orientation. And that's a little bit messy to me. That feels a little bit messy because we have to switch back and forth, even though in both cases we're thinking in terms of the wrist. We're thinking, I want to position the wrist here, I want to orient the wrist in this way. It'd be very nice if an animator doesn't have to switch back and forth between two controls. Now, we simply can't just have the IK handle act as a wrist control because it won't always sit at the position of our wrist. We know if we're dealing with FK that our wrist could well not be in the same location as our IK handle, or if we're dealing with non-stretchy IK, then our IK handle might not be at the wrist location. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to utilize digital assets in Houdini. I'm going to utilize handles on digital assets, and I'm going to create what I'm going to refer to as a super wrist control. And basically what it's going to be an asset that is a sub-asset of our final character, and inside it, it's going to contain our two wrist controls and an IK handle. And we can take advantage of having handles on that digital asset, and we can promote up handles for both of the rotational controls, both our attached control and our detached control, as well as the position of our IK handle. And we can get thus a handle for moving the wrist and a handle for rotating the wrist if we select our super wrist control. We're going to basically have the ability to say, okay, if I select my IK handle, then I'm going to move my IK handle. If I select the wrist control for attached, then I'll be moving the wrist control for attached. If I select the wrist control for detached, that will be the orientations for the detached wrist I'll be controlling. And then on top of all of that, we'll have a small control object that we can select. That will select our asset that encompasses all those controls. It will give us a handle for each of those controls, and we can actually toggle the visibility of those handles. We'll talk a little bit about that when we come up to having those handles implemented. But we can toggle the visibility, and we can choose to work with either the attached and the IK or the detached and the IK, all in one place. We don't have to keep selecting different objects. We just have a rotational and a positional handle in our view, and they can be separate from each other. You could have a position handle over here because that's where our IK handle happens to be. If our wrist actually is over here, then we could have a rotation handle sat around our wrist in a different place in space. So they can be separate, but we don't have to select back and forth. We can simply come over here, click on this handle and rotate it, or come over here, click on this handle and translate it, which is going to be very, very useful. I personally think this makes life for an animator just that little bit easier, because if they're dealing with IK, they're not forced to switch back and forth to position and orient something where they're really thinking in terms of the wrist. They're thinking in terms of a single object, so really it should act like a single object. So with that, that's an overview of the wrist control. This is the design behind the wrist control, why it came about, what kind of functionality it needs. Over the next couple of videos, we'll actually go about implementing this control. So with that, that will wrap up this video. Thanks a lot, everyone.